Kia ora, I'm Fiona Whyte and I feel very privileged to sit down with Mark this afternoon and talk to you about Governance Bites. Today we're actually going to talk about keeping directors relevant. What does that mean? Well, hang on and we'll let you know.
Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and as you just heard today, I have the privilege of spending time with Fiona Whyte. Fiona, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's awesome to see you again. Now, you've got a strong banking background. You were in banking for 20 years, and foreign exchange, a lot of foreign exchange, right? And then around the time that we worked together at the FMA, you had this opportunity, because you've done volunteer work in Cambodia, hadn't you?
Yes.
And so you had an opportunity to get pulled onto a board in Cambodia.
Yeah.
Can you tell us briefly a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was fantastic. There was a microfinance institution, so lending to sort of rural communities. I don't know if people know too much about microfinance, but it's kind of lending to help provide capital to people that really have got no access to good capital. You know, there's money sharks, money lenders around that charge heinous rates like 20% a month and all sorts of egregious things. So providing capital to people that really need it to help them build their businesses and their livelihoods was something that I was quite passionate about, and I started exploring that after my first trip in Cambodia. Did a couple of volunteer stints, went back a couple of times, and they had a lovely program called Bankers with Vision, and so I did a couple of quick 1 week assignments on that, and then you do a little recap and a review, and then the work found its way to head office in London, and the next minute I'm getting a call from someone saying, would you like to join the board? And I honestly had no idea what that meant at the time, and I'm like, yes, of course. And it started my journey.
And you ended up on a board with a whole lot of fantastic experienced directors with very strong processes, so it couldn't have been a better training ground, could it?
Fantastic training ground, yes.
So we want to talk, as you said, about keeping directors relevant. And one way of doing so is through periodic board evaluations. Can you tell me what they are? What are board evaluations?
Just like we all know what our annual performance review process is like, for those of us in the kind of corporate world, well, it's the same for a board, right? If you kind of go through that process once a year and just sit down and sort of ask a series of questions, it can be internal or it could be external. I've been through that process both ways. Here in New Zealand went through an external process at one time, and the advantage of that is that you have some independence to that, and so you can flesh out questions and they can be raised with the chair or pick things up afterwards. And then similarly in Cambodia we run through an internal process every year and ask questions, and just getting that balance of just taking a moment to just say, is everybody pulling their weight? Is everybody really invested in this? Is everybody bringing new things to the table? Are they growing themselves? Are they continuing to provide new insights? Are they continuing to challenge? Are they really interested? Because I'm sure at times we've been on boards where there's been one poor board member who's perhaps been a little bit too stretched and still on the board thinking that's a good idea, but really probably should just say, hey, you know what, I haven't got the capacity to serve on this board right now, and let it go.
How much of that process is anonymous versus actually sitting openly in a room and discussing?
Good question. It is anonymous. We do it on a online survey, and so there's a standardised set of standardised questions, maybe about 20 odd questions, that each board member will do a self-evaluation and then also rate all of their fellow board members. And interestingly, usually the self-evaluations are harder. Like we're harder on ourselves than what the rest of the team is, so that's always quite interesting. But then the secretariat function of the organisation will then anonymise that and provide the results.
Right.
So then as a committee, and the governance and REM committee, we look at the collective results, or we look at, we might look at the individual board member results, but we've got the aggregated scores.
Okay, right. So the first part of the process is very anonymous. Everyone's evaluating each other and evaluating themselves. And then somebody, whether it's internal or external, certainly some form of independence there by the sounds of it, collating all that together. And then you can have an open discussion about the results of that evaluation.
Yeah.
Right. What sort of questions are asked?
Well, a lot of the questions are designed to flesh out that relevance, right? And it could be around, is it evident that they read the papers? What kind of questions are they asking? Are they comfortable to ask the difficult questions? is there groupthink? What kind of things are going on there? Like, are they bringing new ideas? Is it clear that they've got the organisation's mission and vision in mind? Are they are they supportive? Are they supportive of management but challenging management? There's always that tension between the two.
Yeah.
And then I think there's also a challenge for independent directors versus executive directors, because executive directors are in the business all day, every day,
Yes.
whereas independents are sort of dipping their toe in once a quarter. Well, invariably there's things to do each week, but the meetings are once a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of getting a sense of how involved they are and just kind of getting that connectivity between the independents. And I think there's a real importance of having a good balance of independent directors on the board to make sure that the questions are being asked, that management might be too involved in the business and they're not necessarily thinking as strategically, or
they're not lifting themselves above the day-to-day and the governance.
And because there's always fires to fight, right? There's always demands on everybody's times. There's always issues that are cropping up.
So it's important to make sure that the governance conversations are elevated to a governance level and you're not dragging management issues into the boardroom.
Yeah.
And I take it generally the board evaluation questionnaires will be a lot of Likert scale with the odd agile comment here. Is that how they work?
So you kind of, whether you've got a 1 to 5 rating or a 1 to 10 rating, and score yourself and others on each of the questions. So it does take a little bit of time and effort, not too much, but I know when we wanted to kind of reintroduce them on the current board a couple of years ago, different cultural styles are like, is this really necessary? Do we really have to do this? And it's like, actually it's really good hygiene and it's really good kind of accountability, and it does help people to self-reflect and evaluate, am I bringing what I need to bring to this organisation?
Or is my value done? Is it time to step aside?
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you think that director tenure should be limited? Is there a period of time at which you find that that directors will always be stale after X number of terms or X number of years? Is there something along those lines, or what do you think?
That's a really great question, and it's something that perhaps a few years ago I would have been really staunch on and say, right, I had initially worked in an organisation that had 3-year terms, and so you're voted on, every 3 years, and you know that at the end of that 3-year cycle, your term might conclude, like it did for one term that I did on one board, or it might be that you are still required and you will continue on for another season. And in the 10 plus years that I've been involved in my current board, there was a shareholder change in the middle, and so again at that point in time other board members left, and then I think I became a going concern. They decided to keep me on, and I was like, hang on a minute, this is starting to stretch out to a decent amount of time. But effectively they were the same organisation, but they were quite different organisations and quite different boards, and so there's also real value in having some longevity on the board and having someone that knows the organisation. If you had a whole board of 8 or 9 people that have been on the board 10 or 15 years, that's not going to be great. It could be big risks of groupthink and stale thinking kind of thing. Not always, but there is a high risk, right? But if you've got people that have been on the board a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5, 8, 10, and it's managed around succession planning, and you've got the right skill set and the right matrix that the organisation needs at the time, because the organisations grow and change, and this organisation that I've been on has grown significantly or exponentially in the time that I've been on the board. So, there will come a day when my skill set will, come to a close and I'll need to step back and move on, and someone else will need to come on for sure.
Yeah, I feel like rather than having a hard and fast limit to the number of terms or number of years that an individual board member can do, it feels like it should be more around the culture of the board and board evaluations and recognising when you're not adding value anymore and stepping aside. The hard and fast rule, as you say, you might have a director that continues to add tremendous value for 10 or 15 years, and if you have a rule in your constitution or in your board charter that says you can only do 2 terms or 3 terms of 3 years, and the rules say you have to go now, that's not necessarily the best outcome for the organisation.
It is a tense time, and like with working on an international NGO, there are some hard and fast rules like that, and even within Cambodia, within the regulatory framework, there are requirements for you to serve for like a 3-year term and then kind of get reaffirmed by the central bank, so that there is that rigour around that.
Right, because the entity that you're on the board of, Woori, is that right?
Woori
Bank.
Bank.
Okay. It's a registered bank in Cambodia.
Yeah,
Right.
They call it
A commercial bank. So
Yeah.
it has, of course, some really strong rules and stuff around it.
Yep.
The same way any registered bank in New Zealand would have strong rules around its
That's right.
governance.
Yeah.
Right. So do you feel then that there is an alternative to having a hard and fast rule of limiting tenure? Do you think board evaluations are enough? Is it a combination of board evaluations and culture? Or is there actually a place for your time's up, you've got to go now?
I think it's a hybrid, a mix of all of those things, and I think, you know, the question around what can we do, and like every year I sign an annual commitment letter, and every year at the start of the year when I sign that, I sit there and go, you know what, looking at the year ahead, is this something that I want to continue to do? Is it something that I want to continue to serve into? Equally, is my skill set still relevant? You know, like, am I still feeling like I'm adding value in that? And I think that process could be built out a little more, you know, around the board evaluation time, or maybe sort of synced in, but I think that's a helpful tool to kind of go through. You know, ideally you might have a conversation with the chair at the same time, have an informal chat, that kind of thing, but at the moment it's an annual confirmation letter. You consider it and reflect and go, you know what, yes, okay.
It really comes down to ultimately the individual director having the integrity and to be aware of when their time is done, and knowing that that's actually going to reflect on you in your future governance career, because if you stay on a board when you're stale, that's going to drive your reputation.
Yeah.
So you actually need to know it's time to step back and add value somewhere else.
Yeah, and because
Right.
it's in a really important role, and so the organisation needs the right people with the right skills around the table.
Yes. So moving on then to more of the succession planning concept, when a director leaves a board, how do they ensure that they don't leave a void?
Good question. I think it's you front run that before someone leaves. You know, like previously, you know, you might look at a maturity table and say, okay, I've got 5 directors, or I've got 8 directors, and they started on this date, and they've served for 3 years or 10 years or 2 years or whatever it is, and you kind of map it out like a ladder. And so you're thinking, right, what are the skills that I've got on? What is the duration of time that they've been there? And then go, right, we're going to need to have this. Well, this person's going to need to cycle off, and it has indicated that they'll cycle off at the end of the year or next year, right? And so then you're going, okay, I need someone else with whether it's accounting skills or legal skills or subject matter expertise in technology or whatever else it is, to go, okay, we're going to need to fill that in the next year, so we need to start considering candidates now.
Right. So a combination there of your skills matrix, knowing what skills you need on the board, which can change over time according to the strategy, together with the understanding of what the current tenure is of each person on the board, and frank conversations with each of those board members about how long are you here for another term? What's your horizon on this entity? And planning far enough in advance to start looking for successors before they depart.
Yeah,
Right.
and managing diversity as well, getting the right mix. So we have Koreans, Cambodians, and me on the board, and sometimes there's 3 languages spoken across the boardroom, which is fun.
Yeah, thank you for Google Translate. So how far in advance should a board consider that succession planning?
I think it's at least once a year. It should be our governance and REM committee meets twice a year, and I think it is part of something that should be on the board agenda, and it's something that's planned into and it's discussed at least once a year, if not twice.
And for those individuals, so for example, if I'm on a board and I'm signalling that I'm going to be departing at some point, how far in advance would you then want to go, okay, well, Mark's departing, we need to start now thinking about what's going to happen next? Is that a year out? Is it 2 years out? Is it 3 years out?
I think at least a year out, because if you think some boards will meet monthly, depending on the size of the organisation, some will meet quarterly, some might only meet a couple of times a year. So it really depends on size of the organisation, and also how many members are on the board at that point in time. It could be a really lean board where you've only got 4 or 5 people, or it could be a board where there might be 8 or 9 or 10, and if it's at the other end of the spectrum where you already have a number of people on, then there's a little bit less pressure because you've still got a good bandwidth across the board already.
Yes.
So it kind of depends on, are you like a little bit lean at 4 or 5, or are you, you've got 8 or 9 people.
Have you got some capacity to deal with a gap for a short term? I guess you also need to consider how long is it going to take to replace somebody.
Yes.
That will be
and the market you're in. So in a country like New Zealand, it'd be a little bit more simpler and straightforward. And in developing economies, you've got other
compared to Cambodia,
other different skill sets and metrics. And of course, we're trying to look for Cambodian nationals because you want that succession planning. Absolutely, in terms of it's a local business in a different country.
Yeah,
it's helpful having insight from Western country or from South Korea, but equally it's great to have more local people on the board too.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other risks on a board is there may be circumstances that arise that require a few directors to resign in short succession. What can a board do to reduce the risk that you might have a quick succession of resignations?
I feel like we've already covered that in terms of if you've got it on your GNR committee or whatever your equivalent is and you're addressing it every year, there shouldn't be too many surprises unless there's like in New Zealand governance issues. We've had some pretty big issues recently and that has required people to go pretty quickly. But ideally that's more of a dramatic worst case scenario rather than I think it's understanding your board, your organisation, thinking about it proactively every year and I would hope that you're not in that situation to need to have to do that.
So it is about open and frank conversations and being on top of it because I work in life insurance. We know it can happen at any time, right? Where a health event could happen, which just means that someone has to suddenly pull back. So it's about being ready for those at any time. It's risk management really, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. For sure.
Fiona, that's been cool. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
It's been a long time since we first met when you joined the FMA, and this governance journey you've been on, and now to the extent that you're on the board of a commercial bank in Cambodia, which is just
mind blowing.
That is amazing. That's a really as I was talking to you before, saying the next step, if you were wanting to go that way, would potentially be being on the board of a local New Zealand registered bank or non-bank deposit taker, right? It's the same thing. And you've got some amazing skills for that. So sharing those today, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. And if anybody has questions or they want to follow up or anything, just sing out. Happy to have some more conversations.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you for joining us and see you next episode. Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favourite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.